The old brownstone on Lexington Avenue had seen better days. Its red brick facade was crumbling at the edges, and the fire escape clung to its side like a rusty skeleton. But for Marcus Chen, a struggling graphic designer fresh out of college, apartment 4A was all he could afford in Manhattan. It was Mrs. Kowalski, the building superintendent, who first mentioned her. "Don't go to the 7th floor," she said, her Polish accent thick as fog. She handed him the keys with trembling fingers. "Especially not at night. And if you hear scratching on the pipes, ignore it." Marcus laughed it off. Every old New York building had its ghost stories, its eccentric residents who became urban legends. He'd lived through enough dorm hazing to know better than to fall for spooky tales. That confidence lasted exactly 3 days. The first incident happened on a Tuesday evening. Marcus was working late, his desk lamp the only light in his small studio. The radiator had been silent all evening when suddenly, a rhythmic scratching echoed through the pipes. Not the usual clanking of old heating systems, but deliberate, measured. Scratch, 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 pause. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He put his headphones on and turned up his music. But the scratching grew louder, as if whatever made the sound knew he was trying to ignore it. And then came the whisper, so faint he thought he'd imagined it, traveling through the ventilation system. "Come up, come up, come up." The voice was female, each syllable stretched like taffy, sweet and rotten at once. Marcus ripped off his headphones. His heart hammered against his ribs. The apartment fell silent again, but the air felt different now. Heavier, as if something was pressing down on the room. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. He'd find wet footprints in his apartment. Small, woman's feet, leading from his door to his bedroom window. Even though his door had been locked, his milk would spoil overnight, turning black and fetid. His reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes showed him a second face behind his own, pale with hollow eyes and a smile too wide for any human face. But the worst was the crying. Every night at 3:17 a.m. he'd wake to the sound of a woman sobbing. It came from above, from the 7th floor. The sobs were desperate, broken, the sound of someone who'd lost everything. Sometimes between the cries he heard words. "Help me. Someone please, I'm still here, I'm still here." Marcus asked his neighbors about it. Old Mr. Rodriguez in 4B just shook his head and crossed himself. The young couple in 5A pretended they couldn't hear it. Only Sarah, a bartender who lived in 3D, was willing to talk. Her name was Elizabeth Harrow. Sarah whispered over coffee at the bodega on the corner. She lived in 7B back in the early 2000s. Beautiful woman, or so I've heard. A pianist. She'd play at night, and the whole building would listen. What happened to her? Sarah's eyes darkened. Her husband happened. David Harrow. Charming guy, worked on Wall Street. But behind closed doors he was a monster. The neighbors heard fights, things breaking. Mrs. Kowalski called the cops twice, but Elizabeth always covered for him. Said she'd fallen, walked into a door, the usual lies. Marcus felt his stomach turn. He knew where this was going. One night the music stopped. No more piano. No more Elizabeth at the mailboxes. Her husband told everyone she'd left him, moved back to her family in Vermont. He seemed devastated, played the grieving abandoned husband perfectly. Then he moved out a month later. But she never left, did she? Sarah shook her head slowly. 3 years ago they renovated 7B for a new tenant. When they tore up the floorboards beneath the upright piano, they found her. What was left of her anyway. He'd killed her, buried her in her own apartment, then kept playing her records every night so the neighbors wouldn't suspect anything. Marcus felt sick. Why didn't anyone investigate when she disappeared? This is New York, Marcus. People disappear all the time, start new lives. And her husband was convincing. He fooled everyone. Sarah leaned closer. But here's the thing. After they found her body and gave her a proper burial, people thought it would stop. The crying, the scratching, all of it. But it didn't. If anything, it got worse. It's like she's not just haunted by what happened to her. She's angry. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if Elizabeth Harrow could hear his thoughts. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the crying began, but this time it was different. This time it sounded like it was coming from inside his apartment. He turned on every light and found nothing. But in his bedroom, the temperature had dropped so drastically he could see his breath. And on his window, condensation had formed words, written by an invisible finger. "Help me find him." Marcus stumbled backward. The words began to drip down the glass like tears. I don't know how," he said aloud, feeling foolish for talking to empty air. The temperature dropped further. The lights flickered. And then, in his peripheral vision, he saw her. She stood in the corner of his room, her form translucent and flickering like a dying light bulb. Elizabeth Harrow had been beautiful once. You could still see it in the structure of her face, the elegant curve of her neck. But death and rage had twisted her features. Her eyes were black voids, her mouth frozen in a silent scream, and her neck bent at an impossible angle. Her hair hung wet and stringy, as if she'd just emerged from water, though her apartment had been dry when they found her. Most horrifying were her hands. The fingers were worn to the bone, as if she'd spent years clawing at something. Blood, brown and old, caked under what remained of her fingernails. "He's still out there," she whispered, and her voice was like wind through a graveyard. "He's still free. He killed me, and he's free." Marcus wanted to run, to scream, but his body wouldn't obey. "I'm sorry," he managed. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." Her head tie, the window shattered. Marcus's belongings flew across the room as if caught in a tornado. Books, clothes, dishes, all spinning in a maelstrom of fury. And in the center of it all, Elizabeth's ghost grew more solid, more terrible, her mouth opening wider and wider until it seemed to encompass the entire room. "Find him, make him pay, or I'll never rest. I'll never let any of you rest." Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The objects clattered to the floor. The cold receded. Elizabeth was gone. Marcus stood in the wreckage of his apartment, trembling, and realized he had a choice: move out and let someone else deal with her, or try to help. The next morning he started digging. David Harrow had covered his tracks well, but not perfectly. Marcus, armed with his laptop and a determination fueled by sleepless nights, became an amateur detective. He scoured old news articles, property records, social media. He found that David had changed his name after moving from New York. Now he went by David Harris. He'd remarried, had 2 kids, and lived in a comfortable suburb of Philadelphia. He worked in real estate now, had a nice house, a good reputation. He'd gotten away with it completely. Marcus compiled everything he'd found: the timeline of Elizabeth's disappearance, the discovery of her body, evidence that David had lied about her leaving, even old photos that showed Elizabeth with bruises she'd tried to hide with makeup. He made copies of everything and sent them to the Philadelphia police, to journalists, to true crime podcasters who might take interest. He also sent a copy to David Harrow himself with a simple note: "Elizabeth wants you to know she's still here." That night, at 3:17 a.m., Marcus woke not to crying, but to music. Someone was playing piano in the building. The melody was beautiful and haunting, filled with a sadness that brought tears to his eyes. He got up and walked to his door. In the hallway, other residents were emerging from their apartments, drawn by the music. Together, they climbed the stairs to the 7th floor. The door to apartment 7B stood open. Inside, though the apartment was empty and unfurnished, they could all see her. Elizabeth sat at an invisible piano, her fingers dancing over invisible keys, and she was whole again. Beautiful, young, alive in a way ghosts shouldn't be. She played until the sun rose, and when the last note faded, she looked directly at Marcus and smiled. Not the terrible smile of the vengeful spirit, but a genuine smile of gratitude. "Thank you," she mouthed, and then she faded like morning mist. 3 weeks later, Marcus read that David Harrow had been arrested. The evidence Marcus had compiled, combined with renewed police investigation, had been enough. They'd found additional evidence in David's old storage unit, Elizabeth's jewelry, her identification, items he'd kept as trophies. He would stand trial for murder. The building on Lexington Avenue grew quiet after that. No more scratching in the pipes, no more cold spots or mysterious footprints. Mrs. Kowalski told Marcus that for the first time in years, she felt at peace in her own building. But Marcus knew Elizabeth wasn't completely gone. Sometimes on quiet nights he'd hear the faint sound of piano music drifting through the air. Not sad anymore, but peaceful. Beautiful. Elizabeth Harrow had found her justice, and finally, she could rest. Marcus sat in his new office in Brooklyn, sunlight streaming through the windows of the design studio he now co-owned. 5 years had passed since he'd lived in that cramped apartment on Lexington Avenue. 5 years since he'd encountered the ghost of Elizabeth Harrow. A lot had changed. His career had taken off after a true crime podcast featured his story and his role in helping bring David Harrow to justice. He'd been interviewed dozens of times, had even consulted on a documentary about the case. But more than professional success, something deeper had shifted in him. He'd learned that the dead don't always rest easy, not when they've suffered injustice. Elizabeth's haunting hadn't been about frightening the living. It had been a desperate cry for help, for someone to see her, to acknowledge what had been done to her, to ensure her killer didn't get to live a comfortable life while she rotted beneath floorboards. His friend Sarah had once asked him if he believed in ghosts before all this happened. He'd said no. Now he understood that ghosts weren't just spirits of the dead. They were the weight of unfinished business, the echo of wrongs that demanded to be made right. David Harrow was serving a life sentence. Marcus had attended the trial, had seen Elizabeth's family finally get closure. Her mother had hugged him afterward, crying, thanking him for giving them their daughter's story back, for proving she hadn't just abandoned everyone. But the experience had taught Marcus something troubling too. How many other Elizabeth Harrows were out there? How many people had disappeared into the cracks of society, their stories untold, their killers walking free? The dead could haunt, but what about those whose voices had been silenced in other ways? He'd started using his design skills to help missing persons organizations, creating compelling social media campaigns, working with domestic violence shelters. He'd learned that you didn't need to see ghosts to recognize the invisible suffering around you. Mrs. Kowalski still texted him occasionally. The building was different now, she said. Lighter. New tenants in 7B reported it was the most peaceful apartment they'd ever lived in. Sometimes they heard music, but it made them feel calm, not afraid. Marcus believed Elizabeth was truly at peace now. Justice, even delayed, had allowed her spirit to heal. Late at night, when he was working alone in his studio, Marcus sometimes thought about that terror he'd felt. The shattering windows, the black eyes, the rage of a woman who'd been murdered and forgotten. He understood now that her anger hadn't been evil. It had been righteous. It had been the fury of someone who'd been denied everything. Her life, her voice, her story, her justice. And perhaps that was the real horror. Not the ghost itself, but what had created it. The real monster hadn't been the spirit of Elizabeth Harrow. It had been the system that failed her when she was alive. The neighbors who heard but didn't help enough. The man who killed her and smiled his way into a new life. The supernatural was terrifying, yes. But Marcus had learned that the true evil in this world was far more ordinary. It wore a suit and tie, smiled at dinner parties, and slept peacefully at night despite the blood on its hands. Elizabeth's haunting had been a gift, in a way. A reminder that every person's life mattered, that every injustice left a mark on the world, visible or not. The dead might be silent, but their stories remained, waiting for someone to listen, to care, to act. Marcus turned back to his computer, to the missing person case he was designing materials for. A young woman who disappeared from a small town in Ohio, whose family was desperate for answers. He'd learned from the best teacher he could have asked for, a ghost who refused to be forgotten, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure that others, living and dead, wouldn't be forgotten either. Some hauntings Marcus had learned were meant to change the living. Elizabeth Harrow had changed him, had shown him that sometimes the most important thing we can do is bear witness to suffering, to refuse to look away, to demand justice even when it seems impossible. That was her final gift to him, and to everyone who'd heard her cry in the night. Not all ghosts wanted to frighten, some just wanted to be heard. And now, finally, Elizabeth's voice would echo, not in haunted hallways, but in the good works of those she'd touched, in the lives saved by people who'd learned from her story to speak up, to investigate, to never assume that someone's silence meant consent or peace. She'd been a horror, yes, but she'd also been a teacher, a warrior, and ultimately, a catalyst for justice. And that, Marcus thought, was the most powerful kind of haunting there could be.